I'm now reading chapter 5 of the biography of Isaiah Berlin. The author is Michael Ignatieff. Maybe I should mention that this book is quite old and I bought from a bookstore in Princeton with a discount. But I liked it. I think a book is like a jewel or pearl. Some people like it very much. Other people may feel it is garbage. This is a great book for me. It's fun to read. Okay, chapter 5, Oxford 1928 to 1932. He went up to Oxford in the autumn of 1928, a plump young man with crinkly black hair and animated dark eyes, bushy eyebrows, and thick glasses. He wore a dark three-piece suit like his father, and in photographs cradled his left arm. His mother worried about him. He was bookish, didn't dance, didn't circulate, but she needn't have done. Oxford was a liberation. He was getting away from his parents and launching himself into the big world. The college that had chosen him, Corpus, was a small, almost exclusively Gentile establishment, which produced clergymen and dons, specialized in the classics, and set its face against all manifestations of the 20th century. There were no typewriters in the college office. The president wrote every piece of correspondence out in his own copper-plate hand. The tutors did not approve of the new syllabus of philosophy, politics, and economics, introduced in 1920, and undergraduates of Corpus were not supposed to read these subjects. A generation of glamorous undergraduates, Cyril Connolly, Harold Acton, Brian Howard, Evelyn Waugh, was just graduating as Berlin arrived. He remembered hearing Harold Acton reading Sea and the Sardinia by D.H. Lawrence in a very oily, buttery voice, and recalling at the homoerotic affection of it all. Homosexuality was not just a sexual disposition in the 1920s. It was also a type of a style of a revolt against the dunder-headed anti-intellectualism of the public schools. Looking back, Berlin remembered extravagant Latin America, the Latin American, the self-styled Queen of Puro, who gave loud parties in the house that the college proctors used to raid, and where it was reputed indecencies went on. There was another languid aesthete named Frank Curtis, whose father was reputed to be a colonel in the Guards, and who insisted on being called Francis Capel. If asked what college he went to, he drawled, "My dear, I simply cannot remember." The likes of a Capel read Transition, a surrealist journal published in Paris, and went around Oxford Street carrying lavatory chains with which to defend themselves with the hearties, bluff public school boys in rugby shirts who drank beer and liked to attack penises. The University Berlin entered in 1928 almost exclusively male, middle class, devoted to the teaching of the classics, no longer exists, any more than the horse-drawn cabs that still met the trains at Oxford Station. It was Oxford ruled by the male public school ethos, by class privilege, by an ideal of a civilized gentility, which faced its first inquisition by conscience in the 1930s. The aesthetes, he remembers, were killed stone dead by the financial crisis of 1931. Their father no longer had the money to pay for their clothes and their subscriptions to French magazines, and with the onset of the Depression, they woke to the reality that they would have to buckle down to jobs upon graduation. His mother need not have worried. He was soon the center of a circle of friends, who came to include John Hilton, Bernard Spencer, Martin Cooper, and Stephen Spender. In his first 3 years, he lived in the college annex in Magpie Lane. The rooms were heated with coal fires. There was no running water. A college servant, the scout, woke the young man up every morning, bearing a ewer, E-W-E-R, of hot water for washing and shaving. The toilets were a cold run across the quad. Mornings began with prayers in chapel, or a bleary-eyed roll call, usually taken in pajamas, in the dining hall for those, like Isaiah, who did not attend the prayers. Lunch was bread and cheese, fetched from the dining hall and taken in one's room. Dinner was in hall. Scholars like Isaiah had to wear a gown, and one of the classics scholars had to pronounce a long Latin grace. He learned it by heart and remembered his anxiety that, as a Jew, he might be asked to recite it in public. He never was. He had won a scholarship to read classics and modern history, but the college tutor took one look at his classics and said they would never do. He was to read Pas Mos, a preparatory course in classics, for 2 terms, and then began grades, a 7-term course in ancient history and philosophy, both ancient and modern. The classics formed yet another geological stratum of his learning, just as the cadences of Cicero and Seneca were to become one of the sources of his rhetoric. But he was not a strong classic scholar. Classicists had neat, tiny minds. His father neither. Berlin liked to contradict the image others had of him as a high flyer. The accent of a memory was upon hard work late at night. Xenophon, Herodotus, Seneca, Plautus, and Ernest Scripps read aloud every week to his somnolent and uninspired classics tutor. His essays on most subjects were much too long. The tutor grumbled. Whenever he indulged in a purple passage, the Dr. Grundy was there to write a deflating "oh" in the margin. Some deflation of a schoolboy Hebraism was to his benefit. Quote, "I did discover I was nothing like as good as some people. I didn't mind. I am unambitious, no wish to shine." End quote. This humble self-portrait is disingenuous. Stephen Spender, his contemporary, met him after his first year and remembered that already Isaiah was a famous undergraduate. Famous for what? For talking. His rooms in Corpus become a place of a resort for talk and gossip. One friend, Bernard Spencer, was a poet, an aesthete whom the heartier members of college attacked one night, shaving off half of his whiskers. Martin Cooper had musical tastes. Spender was reading English. The talk in Isaiah's rooms was about concerts, plays, poems, and novels, not the Wall Street crash. The German elections or the fate of the Labour government. There were parties organized on the principle that the food should reflect the character of the person invited. The black-tempered Humphrey House was served a black meal, black pudding, burned toast, black coffee, black olives. The budding poet Stephen Spender was served alphabet soup. At the end of his second year, in 1930, Berlin inherited the editorship of Oxford Outlook, an undergraduate magazine, from his old school friend, Arthur Calder Marshall. Outlook had an arch, high-brow tone. It took its intellectual cues from the fashionable London magazines like London Mercury and Criterion. A certain affection of worldly knowledge and sophistication was the ruling style, and Isaiah's early contributions borrowed this idiom. Editing Outlook brought him into contact with all of the brightest undergraduates of his generation. Few memories of undergraduate roistering remain. He did recall once having drunk a few too many punches at a party, staggering up the high street, weaving to and fro, tipping his hat to the ladies and apologizing for his deportment. Stephen Spender remembered an undergraduate party where Isaiah stood at the window with a ball in his hand, chucking cherries at passers-by. But these were exceptional. Another contemporary, Diana Harbeck, recorded that he seemed completely adult at a time when his youthful friends were only just emerging from adolescence. He did seem astonishingly cosmopolitan. Skeptics wondered when he found time actually to acquire his erudition. Sheila Grant Duff, who met Berlin in early 1931, used to wonder whether he actually read the books he cited so effortlessly. Perhaps he sat in the middle of the room and imbibed them. He was in fact a dipper, with an extraordinary acute sense, from a few pages, of whether a book was worth reading, and he sometimes claimed familiarity with a work he hardly knew at all. A lifelong dislike of Freud, for example, was based on only causal acquaintance with what Freud had actually written. A selective intelligence coupled with a prodigious memory enabled him to amass the breadth of reference that amazed his friends. But he was never an orderly worker. His workrooms were a cozy kiosk, cluttered with books and papers, gramophone records, unanswered letters, and half-drunk cups of tea. He liked reading at night, preferably in bed, and lay there, browsing and scribbling at a furious rate until 2, sometimes 3 in the morning, and then sleeping through breakfast and early tutorials. The person who taught him intellectual self-discipline was a modest Scotsman, Frank Hardy, his philosophy tutor at Corpus. Beginning in Isaiah's second year, Hardy set to work, patiently forcing his brilliant pupil to drive some path through the jungle in his mind. Every week Hardy would listen to Isaiah's undergraduate essay read aloud and then pick it apart, cutting through the purple passages, the flights of a fancy, gently exposing contradictions and inconsistency in a soft, precise Scots accent. Hardy's dissection was sobering, but the effect was inspirational. Remembering these sessions 60 years later, Berlin would become animated, punctuating his words by smacking the palm of his right hand over the top of his left. Obscurity and pretentiousness and sentences which doubled over themselves he brought right after me, from then until this moment. Hardy became the single most important intellectual influence upon Berlin's undergraduate life, orienting him toward the British empiricism that became his intellectual morality. It was remarkable that someone so undisciplined and intuitive should have realized how much he needed what this mild, retiring Scotsman had to teach him. But this was to prove a lifetime pattern, seeing in others what he lacked himself, and having the shrewdness and the self-confidence to get in search of it. Oxford philosophy had only just entered the 20th century. Its leading philosophers were still rebuting the Bredelian idealism of the preceding century. As for Russell, Wittgenstein, and the revolution germinating in nearby Cambridge, Oxford philosopher tutors of the late 1920s and early 1930s took little notice. G. E. Moore's Principia Ethica, which did so much to refine the ethical ambience of the Bloomsbury group, was not on any syllabus, though Isaiah found his way to it on his own sometime in 1930s, and was impressed by its expositional clarity, its pure moral tone, and the comforting implication that goodness might be as clear, distinct, and intuitively apprehensible as primary colors. He must also have been impressed by the way in which intellectual skepticism could go hand in hand with social conservatism. Moore wrote, "On any view commonly taken, it seems certain that the preservation of a civilized society, which these rules are necessary to effect, is necessary for the existence, in any great degree, of anything which may be held to be good in itself. The function of a philosophy was to defend civilized society by purifying its talk about itself, clarifying its moral rules, and thereby strengthening the commitment of its young men to its values. The possibility that the values, far from being objectively discernible like colors, might be both contestable and incommensurable, was not on anyone's horizon." From Moore, Isaiah then found his way to Russell, but not from Russell to Wittgenstein. Berlin did not become aware of Wittgenstein until a dashing young undergraduate, Freddie Ayer, wearing, so Isaiah remembered, a very smart dinner jacket and a carnation in his buttonhole, gave a paper on the Tractatus to a gathering of philosophy duns at Christ Church in the spring of 1932. In the summer of 1931, Berlin made a friendship with the most notorious and celebrated young dun of his day, then regarded as mad, bad, and dangerously to know. This was Maurice Bauer, a small, stocky, belligerent-looking classicist, built like a bulldog, who was then dean of Wadham College and the center of a circle of the brightest young duns and undergraduate in Oxford. Oxford is an institution devoted to the seduction of the young, and Borrow was its most assiduous seducer. Cyril Connolly remembered how Borrow collected him and then introduced him around the room. "This is a Connolly, coming, man." "Hasn't come yet." Isaiah first came to Borrow's attention through his friend Martin Cooper, who, hearing that Borrow was looking for someone to check his translation of a poem by the Russian poet Alexander Blok, put the two of them together. The first meeting was not auspicious. Isaiah read the first two lines. "A tempest from the sea, a siren sitting on apple branches." A siren? Isaiah asked to see the original. The Russian word actually meant a winged mythological creature, possibly a fire bird. Borrow looked the word up in the dictionary. "Ba'awa, it says here," he reported gruffly. Since this would never do," he penciled "turtle dove" into the proof and sent it off, obviously miffed that this precocious undergraduate had found his Russian wanting. Still in parting, he told Isaiah to visit him again. Soon Isaiah was in the inner circle. Borrow proved to be a decisive influence. Barrel-shaped, vain, red-faced, voluble, always to be found at parties, roaring in a voice with the carrying power of the last trump. He showed that vitality and appetite for life need not be squeezed out of a dawnish existence. In the 1930s, Borrow liked to portray himself as the leader of the immoral front, all those communities, homosexuals, and nonconformists who stood for pleasure, conviction, and sincerity against the dull, fastidious mandarins of the Oxford Senior Common Rooms. He was also a celebrated wit, sought after and feared in turn for the sharpness of his tone. As Isaiah recalled, the words came in short, sharp bursts of a precisely aimed, concentrated fire as an image, pun, metaphor, parody seemed spontaneously to generate one another in a succession of marvelously imaginative patterns, sometimes rising to high, wildly comical fantasy. Here, in other words, was a Paganini of talk, a virtuoso of that apparently wild, yet discipline-free association that was to become Isaiah's own specialty. Berlin's very diction, the rapid-fire gabble, came from Borrow.